set up a chessboard. A chessboard has 64 squares. The white square is on the right for each player. And on top of the board, there are 32 pieces, so each player has 16 pieces. And each player will have a different color for their pieces. So this is light brown, dark brown. Sometimes it's white and black, which is typical. Sometimes there's other color combinations. Let's go over where all of the pieces start off. Each player has 2 rooks, 1 for each corner. Next to 2 knights, these are the little horses. Next to 2 bishops. Next to a king and queen, which are very powerful pieces. The queen will start off on the color that most closely resembles it. This queen will start off on the green square. This queen will start off on the white square. In front of all of these pieces, there are 8 pawns. Next, we'll go over how all of the pieces, the most important pieces of the game, if you get the other king's piece in checkmate, then you win the game. If you get the other king's piece in check, then they have to make a move to get the king out of check. The king can only move 1 square in each direction at a time, though. So the king can move up, king can move backwards, king can move to the side. The queen is a very powerful piece. The queen can move as much as she wants, even diagonally, backwards, forwards. The queen cannot jump over any player. The queen has to capture a player if she wants to move to that specific piece, but she does not have to capture a piece if she just wants to move to an unoccupied space. Rook is also a very powerful piece. The rook can move from side to side, front and back. The rook cannot move diagonally. The rook can only move in straight lines. A bishop can move only in diagonals. The bishop will stay on the same color square for the duration of the game. So if this bishop were to start right around here, it could only move on the clear squares. If it was the other bishop and it started here, it could only move on the frosted squares. A pawn usually just moves 1 space at a time, but if it's the first move of the game for that pawn, it can move 2 spaces. That rule is only applicable to the first move of the game. And the pawn can only capture diagonally. There is one small variation though. A pawn can capture another pawn in the move of en passant, which is the French term for in passing. So if one pawn moves up 2 spaces and in doing so it lands to the side of the opponent's pawn, that opponent has the opportunity to capture that pawn. We'll review that in another video. The knight is a super interesting piece, and one reason for this is that it's the only piece that can hop over other players, and it does this by moving in an L shape. So it starts on a square like this, the frosted square, and then it moves to the opposite colored square, so the clear square, and it does this in the L shape, so it moves 1 space up, 2 to the right, 1 space up, 2 to the left, or it can even move backwards like this. So 1 space down, 2 to the right, and 1 space down, 2 to the left. So if there's a pawn over here, it can move over here, doesn't have to even deal with the pawn over here or over here. Special moves in chess. In this video, we will review en passant and also talk about what happens if your pawn makes it to the very end of the board. It's a good thing. We will also talk about castling in the next videos. En passant deals with pawns. So just to review, a pawn on its very first move can move 1 space or 2 spaces. Any other move, the pawn can just move 1 space up, or if it's capturing a piece, it can move like this. However, en passant is another way that a pawn can capture another pawn. So let's say this black pawn is here, and on its very first move, this white pawn moves up 2 spaces, landing right next to the pawn of the opposing color. This pawn can go and capture this pawn. Also, if your pawn makes it to the very end of the board, it can be exchanged for any other piece. You can even have 2 queens, which would be super powerful. You just can't have 2 kings. Castling is like doing 2 moves at once. This is what it looks like, and then I'll explain. It can look like this, or it can look like this. So what I just did was that I switched around the king and rook, but neither of them landed in the exact place that the other was. In the very first move that the king or the rook has, the king can move 2 spaces to the right or to the left, and then the rook can move directly next to the king. And the same can happen on the other side. So if it's the first move for this rook, first move for this king, the king can move 2 spaces to the left, and then the rook can move right next to it. Protects the king. So the king is now protected by these pawns, more or less, and the rook is also positioned towards the center of the board, which can be a strategy. About some special rules with castling. So let's say you wanted to do a castle just like this, but what if this bishop was still on this board? That wouldn't be possible because you are castling through a check. See, in this move, the king is in check with the bishop. So that specific castle would not be possible at that time until that goal is taken care of. Or you might want a castle this way, which should be fine because there's nothing that would put the king in check with this specific castle. The king moves 2 spaces here. Also, something could happen, for instance, if this player still had a queen, a castle could definitely not happen like this because the king is moving through check this way. And again, it can only be the first move for the king and the rook. If this rook has already moved, for instance, then only this castle can happen. Check. Check is what happens when one side is threatening to capture another side's king. Let's go over some examples. This bishop can go capture this pawn, or a pawn might not even be here. And then this king is in check because of the bishop threatening this king. Then the king absolutely has to move to get out of check. So the king, for example, could move here. The king could also move here. But king doesn't really have a lot of options in this scenario, but this is an example. Let's go over some other examples of check. So let's say black's rook moves here, then this king absolutely has to respond to that check. So the king could move here, for instance, and get out of check that way. Let's say the knight were, for example, here, and if it hadn't been here, the knight could move here to block the check also, but it all depends on where the pieces are. Here's another check move. Let's say it's black's turn and the move is this. So this pawn is threatening this knight. The knight can actually move here and go and check this king. So the king has to respond to that. Checkmate is how you win the game. You can also win the game if the other player resigns or if you're both using a clock for the game and the other player runs out of time. But for this video, we will just focus on checkmate. Let's explore some checkmate moves. Let's say this is white's move and the queen moves over here. The king can't move anywhere. Wherever the king goes is trouble, so that's checkmate, and white has won the game. Sometimes checkmate can happen in surprising ways. So let's say it's white's move, the rook moves here, this king is in checkmate. Nothing can happen to save this king, although there's so many more pieces on this side. When checkmate happens, it's customary to shake hands and say, fastest checkmate. Checkmate can happen in just a few moves. It's pretty rare, but possible. It's easy to defend against, so it's important to know what it looks like. First of all, white could move here, and this already weakens the king because the king is exposed to this diagonal. And black's move is this, and then the pawn could move here to g4. The first pawn move was f3, and then the queen moves here to h4, and this is checkmate. The king cannot move anywhere to get out of checkmate. Nothing can block the queen's path. Let's see how it looks like for the other side. Let's see how it can happen on the other side. White moves to e4, black moves to f6, white moves to d4. Then the black pawn moves to g5. And then white queen moves over here, and that's checkmate. The king cannot move anywhere to get out of the queen's path, and no black player can block the queen.